when Confucian voices enter into kind of public conversation in Korean society, it's almost always the conservative Confucian voices. The past practices are actually not appropriate today. That gender equality is actually a better way to realize the underlying Confucian values. K-pop star who did something bad in his youth. I think leaning in the direction of canceling does have a connection to Confucian values. Hello, Y Studio. My name is Stephen Angle. I am a professor of Confucian philosophy at Wesleyan University in the US. I think the most important goal for Confucians and for Confucianism is for each of us as an individual to try to become a better person. Ultimately, the goal is to become a sage, but nobody actually becomes a sage, right? That's a lifelong goal. The goal is to be better every day. So that's an individual thing, but Confucians also very much emphasize that we exist in relation to others. So I become better in part by being a better teacher to my students, by being a better husband to my wife, a better parent to my children, and so on. So there's this balance between individuals and always thinking about ourselves as not just individuals, but individuals in relation to others. This idea of relationship is ultimately, for many Confucians, something that expands even beyond the human realm. So certainly we are members of communities, of nation states. Confucian writers often talk about 天下 in Chinese, all under heaven. One of their favorite phrases is to say that we form one body with all things. That means that our relationships exist even to non-human animals, even to our environment. And so ultimately, our responsibilities, our moral responsibilities, are not just to other humans, but to the groups are overlapping and ever expanding. Another central Confucian idea is harmony, and harmony means complementary differences. Given that we care about our families and our children, but we also care about our societies and our nations, but we also care about the environment. So figuring out how to balance all of these things. Fantastic question. Confucianism has always been changing. The society that Kongzi lived in 2,500 years ago was already very different from the society like Jushi, who had a huge influence on Joseon Korea, already very, very different. So, of course, when you get to the 20th century and the 21st century, these changes have accelerated. I think there are really two fundamentally different ways to think about Confucianism with regard to these changes. One, which I would call the conservative approach, is to try to hold on to actual customs and institutions of the past, to try to conserve. The other, which I would call the progressive approach, which I favor, is we think about what are the actual underlying values of Confucianism and ask how to realize those values in a new situation. One example that I've written about, and this comes up in the book, is the question of the relation between genders, right? Traditional Confucianism existed in a very patriarchal society where men were superior to women in many ways. Our modern societies are quite different from that, and that should cause Confucians to ask the question, how should the relations between these groups, men and women, what do Confucian values actually tell us about the relations between genders? I think if we start with the traditional viewpoint, there's nothing fundamentally about gender at the core of Confucian philosophy. Confucian philosophy talks about human nature and our potential to become good and the virtues that we should develop and so on, without distinguishing between men and women. But the patriarchal society has an impact, right? The people who are writing these Confucian texts are almost all men. So gradually, over a few hundred years, I would say that patriarchal values start to influence Confucianism in various ways. And so by the time you get a few hundred years after the life of Kongzi, already people are saying things like there are a special and really inferior kind of virtue, women's virtues. Things like submission, never marrying again if your husband dies. And so for much of its history, Confucianism in its practice has this distinction. So when you get to the modern world, And obviously, society is changing a great deal. No longer in Korea or elsewhere do we expect women to stay in the home. In general, think that women should have equal roles to men. What does Confucianism say about that? And the truth is that Confucianism, because it says everyone should be able to try to develop their virtue, to do that, you have to be engaged in the world. And so a modern Confucian, a progressive Confucian, is someone who says the past practices are actually not appropriate today. Because Confucianism emphasizes all people's human nature is the same, all people can achieve the same virtues, all people should be trying to get better by being engaged in society. So ultimately, a progressive Confucian is in favor of gender equality because of Confucian reasons, not because of some Western practice or something like that. It's rather that we Confucians now see that gender equality is actually a better way to realize the underlying Confucian values. Now let me say a little bit about broader influence on society. It's complicated because on the one hand, you have the, to some degree, underlying Confucian values I think are still important in many East Asian societies, even if people don't label them as Confucian values in terms of how they think about morality, how they think about responsibilities to others. A lot of those values are still there. So that's the level of values. But then there's also this level of practice, of custom. That's where Korean society and some other East Asian societies, you have these conservative Confucians trying to hold on to past customs and practices. You have both of those things going on, and at the same time, obviously, enormous changes through modernization, adaptation of various Western values and institutions and so on. I think it's not surprising that you still see certain differences in perspective between folks in East Asian societies like Korea and folks in Western societies. There are some differences. I think there's also a lot of similarity, but ultimately between the conservative level of customs and the underlying values, that helps to explain why it is in response to certain kinds of social surveys and so on, you would expect to see Koreans leaning more in the direction of emphasizing relationships. I think it's an exaggeration to say that that means that Koreans are collectivist. In fact, I think that collectivist is probably the wrong word to use. Collectivist makes it seem like you don't have an individual identity. You're just defined by the collective. Whereas what I emphasize for Confucianism is relationship. So you do have an individual identity, but that individual identity is made up in part of all of your relationships. The others matter, but you are not sort of sacrificed just for the interests of the collective. I think what I believe is that we should not think the options are two. Either a culture is individualist or it's collectivist. I think we should have three options. So there's individualist or relatively individualist, there's relatively collectivist, and then there's this idea of a relationist or something like that. Again, really puts emphasis on our connections, but without forgetting the individual. But when you emphasize those relationships, then you will care about the influence that a pop star has on their fans, right? Because there's relationships there. Importance of role models is very significant. So I think that often we look at the same evidence and draw the conclusion, aha, collectivist, whereas I think we should draw the conclusion relationist instead. And there's an important difference between those. I think that leaning in the direction of canceling does have a connection to Confucian values. On the other hand, it also seems to me, because of the Confucian emphasis on harmony and on balance, having a very strict sort of rule that, okay, you've gone too far and now we cut you off, we cancel you. A degree to that which that seems to me to be not Confucian. The fundamental Confucian attitude should always be, what can I do or what can we do to help someone become better? I think that if you have a K-pop star who did something bad in his youth, right, a long time ago, then on the one hand, I agree that, as I said, that Confucianism is going to tell us to care about the moral role model. But on the other hand, I think it's also going to say we should be thinking about that individual's possibility for continued moral growth. I feel that canceling someone, refusing to engage, refusing to think about how they've changed already, seems to me to be a mistake. So I could see how Confucianism might push you in this direction, but it seems to me that if you really think about it, Confucianism should also encourage us to be constructive rather than destructive. If you think about the relationship between a parent and a child, if a child makes a mistake, is a good response for a parent to cut them off, to cancel them, right? No. And that underlying relationship of the love and nurturing that a parent has for a child and the love and respect that the child has for a parent, that is a great example, probably the most important example of a Confucian relationship. If the child has made a mistake, that's not just bad for the child, that's bad for the parent, right? That suggests some kind of failing on the part of the parent. So maybe the parent needs to grow also. At the same time, the more extreme the problem is, the more extreme the mistake is, the more it is appropriate to really sort of remove somebody from a given situation. What that person represents is unavoidably problematic in terms of the role modeling function that it has, could to some degree be appropriate. The progressive Confucian perspective is always going to be one of trying to balance these two things. What we get from our relationships broadly in the world and our responsibilities to those relationships, as well as our own responsibilities to ourself as a sort of focus point within this network of relationships. So the question then is, what is the role of progressive Confucianism in Korean society? I am not an expert on Korean society. You know, I offer this suggestion with caution. But my understanding is that when Confucian voices enter into kind of public conversation in Korean society, it's almost always the conservative Confucian voices. And because I think that at least in the background, these Confucian values are still important to many Koreans, then enabling people to realize that progressive Confucianism is an option. In fact, it's a very attractive option in politics and society and in a whole variety of ways. I think in some ways superior to kind of westernized liberalism. Then adding this into the conversation has the potential to be something that a lot of Korean citizens find to be surprisingly attractive and interesting.